Please open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. And we are looking at Sermon on the Mount and just kind of a level of study that's looking towards primarily application, understanding to application, and thinking about how we can apply the teachings of Christ here to our lives. And so this is, I don't know, third or fourth, maybe fifth lesson in this series. And I didn't have any printed notes as far as over what I'll be talking through. You can write down if something that you find to be helpful or important, or you can ask me about it later and I can maybe give you a longer quote. But I wanted to leave plenty of room for the questions and maybe jotting some answers or thoughts down on those questions as well. What I'd like to do is read through these 6 verses, and then I want to just get some initial comments from our congregation on some of the important themes or parts of these verses, and then I want to walk through and kind of teach through some of each of the verses here to kind of bring out some more details, and then we'll end with some discussion questions where we can hopefully apply and think critically about the lessons here that Christ has given to us. So please, would you follow along with me as I read Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 through 32. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it away. Throw it from you, for it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you, for it's better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. And it was said, "Whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce." But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So there's our primary text covering the section there dealing with marriage, fidelity. So what are some thoughts on important features there that stands out as that we ought to be mindful of, or things that just from the basic reading of the text, or even your years of knowledge and reflecting on these issues, that stands out as an important thing to make note of as we look at these verses? Any thoughts, comments as we begin? Phil.
The good, which is the heart, and how our actions will follow our heart.
Okay. Tying actions with the heart that gives birth to them. Okay. Anybody else? Stephanie.
Not that we're supposed to maim ourselves, but that is how serious sin, even the secret sins of the heart.
Yes, the severity with which we ought to regard the presence or potential presence of sin. Okay, good. Somebody else?
Showing his design for marriage, and together for life.
Yeah. I think this is definitely plays into the very basic building blocks of God's design for humanity, which is marriage, family, fidelity. Yeah, for sure. It's and building around that. So yeah, good. Anybody else? There's obviously a lot here, and there's put on the spot. Which one of the 85 things do I maybe think about? You know, but there's a lot here that a lot of us are familiar with. Let me walk through some of these things here. Again, the command itself is found verse 27. It's a quotation of one of the 10 Commandments, and it's given in Exodus chapter 20, repeated again in the same exact way in Deuteronomy chapter 5, and the repetition of the giving of the law. This is not a questionable, like, did people understand this or know this? This was a well-known, understood, and foundational moral command in the scriptures. And again, it's very simple. The word, when it comes to you shall not commit adultery, committing adultery is, again, it's the word that comes from adulterer. An adulterer is someone who has sexual relations between one party who is married and one party who may not be, but at least one of the parties is married. So it is the extramarital sexual activity that is being prohibited here. Another word that again I think we all are aware of and we have at least some idea of, the idea there for lust. It says anyone who looks at a woman with lust. The idea there is lust is this idea of looking for desire. It's used very often actually in the Septuagint. The same word is used speaking of coveting. So it has the idea of looking with desire for something. And so it's this. It's to have an affection towards something, to desire something. Now you can desire something fervently in a good sense, but you can also, like for instance, if you need like food or water, you can have a desire for those things. You can long for, like the Lazarus in Jesus' parable longed for the scraps that were falling from the table of the rich man. These kinds of like intense desires can be for things that are fine and good, but obviously here these are these intense desires for something that is not right. And I think the important thing is to articulate what is not right is because about this desire is that it's disordered in that it is desiring what is something that is not permitted in any situation except for one. We'll talk about that when it comes to, again, God's pattern and principle and building block for marriage and for sexuality. There is a singular rule, a litmus test when it comes to that adultery obviously falls on the outside of. And the word, as you move through there, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. The idea, or causing you to stumble, makes you stumble. The idea there is if your hand or your eye is a cause or a means that is leading to committing an offense or leading you into sin, you are to treat that severely. The idea of a stumbling block or tripping up or stumbling is this idea of being leading into an activity so as to stumble into sin, leading away from the Lord. So that's the picture of what stumbling is. Now, again, the foundational principle that Jesus is referring to that was, again, negatively articulated in the commandments, do not commit adultery. The positive is the command and the design from the first and second chapters of Genesis that the only biblically prescribed, mandated, allowed, and encouraged context for sexual activity is the heterosexual, monogamous, lifelong marriage. That is what God created the relationship for sexual activity to be engaged in between one man and one woman. That is the context. And I remember years ago I read a book by a Christian apologist. And he was interacting with, at that time, which was a very up-and-coming new push for the acceptance of gay, not gay people, because people can be, the acceptance for homosexual activity and things as far as it's okay to be a Christian and engage in these kinds of activities. And so he's writing a book about the Bible's response to that, and he begins by addressing a common objection that people who want to discredit the Bible, they want to put forward their own untoward and disordered desires for having other kinds of sexual activity. They'll say, well, the Bible only talks about homosexuality in like 7 Bible verses, the clobber verses they'll talk about. A couple places in the Old Testament, a couple places in Paul, and a couple places in Ezekiel that, really, do we even know what those mean? And they'll kind of try to dismiss them. And I thought the author, his name is Michael Brown, he does some good work. I thought he did his answer to this was really, really good. He says this, his analogy was this: if I give you a cookbook, a gluten-free cookbook or a sugar-free cookbook, that's what it is on the front cover, and the initial, like the about this cookbook is it's sugar-free and it's why. I only talk about sugar on one page in the cover. But to say that sugar is not an important reality, or the absence of sugar is not an important reality of the cookbook because it's only mentioned on one page, is ridiculous. It's foundational for the entire paradigm that is being built in the book. I thought it was a very helpful analogy when it comes to thinking about God's good plan for what sexuality is and should be inside of the Christian, inside of human activity. It was laid out in a very clear way in Genesis 1 and 2, dealt with various aberrations throughout the scriptures in all kinds of ways. And the fact that the ways it deals with specific, whether it's bestiality only a couple times, or incest only a couple times, or homosexuality only a couple times, that doesn't mean those aren't important, that we can get by those. No, you start from the parameters that this is what it is, which is God created man and woman in the garden. In Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 2, he gave them to one another and told them to be fruitful and multiply. That is God's command. So the pattern, the foundation, which all commands and all prohibitions are to be measured, is the strong undergirding principle of monogamous heterosexual marriage is the only context inside of which there can be a good, righteous, God-glorifying sexual activity that goes on. Everything else outside of that is some form of aberration or sinful deviation. That is the biblical paradigm. And we need to say both things. We need to say both the good, and we need to talk about what is not good. We need to emphasize that it is good. I was listening to a sermon this week, and the pastor said, in our culture, you can go one of two ways. There's 2 ditches. There's the licentiousness where everything goes, and it's a meat grinder, doesn't matter, and it's the world of have your pleasures and whatever you want to. And we know instinctively that ought to be a bad thing. But some Christians almost pull back and say, almost to a Victorian, and say, well, that whole idea of intimacy it's a dirty subject. We don't want to talk about it. We just want to, we can't even talk about those things, which is also a ditch that is dangerous and wrong. It's in a lot of ways as wrong as the other one, because there is a proper place and a good place for those things. Again, the one single place for it, which is marriage. Before marriage, it is not a good thing in any context. After marriage, or outside of marriages, it is not good in any context. And outside of the bonds of marriage for married people, it is not good in any other context. And so we need to think of the proper good and right context as the foundation. So any conversations about Christian sexual morality needs to begin with the first chapters of Genesis 1 and 2, where God creates man and woman in the garden and says, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, subdue it, and this is a good thing. So again, and in the Old Testament, again, Jesus is referring to, quoting the Ten Commandments here. There was a lot of other kinds of prohibitions we'll look at, or at least I'll refer to, but there was a lot of a broader context in the Old Testament of sexual activity that the Old Testament spoke into. I'll read this here. I'll quote this. You may or may not know this. It says this. In the ancient world, most cultures generally held that a married man could have sexual adventures as long as they did not involve a married woman. And that was wrong because it would involve violating the rights of her husband. So in many ancient cultures, there was no cultural sin, there was no cultural taboo upon men engaging in extramarital activity unless it was with a woman who was married. However, a woman was expected to have no such freedom. She was to be chaste before marriage and faithful in marriage. And Jesus here, and we'll talk about in a second here, he makes the point that that men and women are on equal playing fields when it comes to the issues of sexual fidelity. Some rabbis actually, if you think about this, do get close to talking about even Jesus' points when it comes to looking with eyes as lust and really dealing with the lust. I thought this was interesting. I didn't know some of this information before I was studying for tonight. One resource referred to some rabbis speaking about a complaint of men who, quote, gratified their eyes with lewdness. And they'd say, for whoever looks upon a woman's little finger would be as gay, like he's lusting because he's looking at her body in some way. Elsewhere, it was the leg, her voice, her hair, added to the objects that may be sexual enticements. Again, so there was this idea that in some of the context, there was this awareness that that lusting was a thing to be aware of and to be prohibited, even in some of the rabbinical teachings. But that was not the primary atmosphere into which Jesus spoke. There was much more of a loose, popular, loose understanding of particularly divorce and sexuality with divorce. But it wasn't common for people to teach the way that Jesus spoke here in Matthew chapter 5. Now, Jesus clarifies, I think, the intention of the law. He doubles down, he amplifies what the law meant, not just in the activity of sexual adultery, but he brings it to bear on a greater, more in-depth, personal, internal scale. Excuse me. And I guess one other comment about the Jewish way of understanding some of these things. There's some discussion that oftentimes the Jews would have regarded the prohibition against adultery not as one of like purity or faithfulness, but more of one of theft. They put it in the category of theft, which would be similar to a lot of their culture's ideas of those things. It would be stealing what is your neighbor's, as opposed to, again, violating the purity of the marital covenant. But Jesus describes that if you've looked with lust, you've committed adultery in your heart. Now, again, what's interesting here is looking with lust, again, looking with its desire, to desire this person in a way that is untoward, this person is not your spouse, to desire them and think of them in this sexual way. This is what lust refers to. And he says, you have committed adultery with her in your heart. Now the question is, what does this mean? And how do we walk through this? Well, first of all, when we talk about adultery in the heart is the center of your life. It is It is the nerve center through which all of your affections, emotions, ideas, attitudes, everything comes from. And so to say that you have committed adultery in your heart is that you've committed adultery in the center of your being, in all that really pertains to be you. That is what you have done. And this ought to be contrasted, I think, if you look back at verse 8, Jesus says, blessed are the pure in heart. Again, so we have this contrast of the pure in heart who are blessed versus those who have committed adultery in their hearts, I think is an appropriate contrast there. Now, one question I think gets brought up, at least thought of, is, well, severity-wise, are you saying is Jesus saying that the sin of adultery in the heart is of the same severity of adultery in action, or is one sin the same seriousness as the other? I think we have to be careful how we answer that. For one, as a general rule, we all agree, and I believe the Bible teaches that all sins results in a separation from God, and there is consequences because of sin. So there is no such thing as a not too bad sin. But there are, I think, cases and points and situations where some sins are worse than others. I'll give you a couple of examples. When Jesus is standing in front of Pilate, he says to Pilate, basically, that while Pilate's one sentencing him to death, the Jews who handed him over have committed the greater sin, John 19:11. There is a greater severity in there. Or when Jesus distinguishes between blaspheming the Son of Man versus blaspheming the Holy Spirit, he says one can be forgiven, the other can't be. There's a severity, some kind of a distinction there in those activities. Or in Luke chapter, I believe it's Luke chapter, what do I have here? 12. Jesus tells about the servant who knew his master's will and didn't do it will receive many lashes. But the servant who didn't know his master's will and still does stuff worthy of a flogging will receive a few. In other words, they're both going to receive punishment, but the ones who had greater knowledge and greater understanding, there is a greater severity of consequence. And so with all that to say is, I think it's when we think about, severity of sin, there's definitely a difference in the temporal ramifications and the consequences between, say, looking with lust or being angry in your heart versus committing adultery or committing murder. There are difference in temporal consequences. But my hope is not to minimize the severity of anger or lust, because I think all too often in our minds and hearts, we don't elevate the severity of murder and adultery to where they ought to be. And so not that we need to bring the one down, but they all need to be up higher as severe in the eyes of God. So again, Jesus says, if you've looked with lust, you've committed adultery in your heart. And we don't need to fall into the foolish wrong ditch to say, if looking with lust is the same as committing adultery, well, then in for a penny, in for a pound, why not? That's not the right perspective to understand, first of all, God's prohibitions or even the consequences relating to sinful activities, whether it's, again, in the heart that is hopefully being wrestled and sin being mortified versus the lived out consequences. And Paul goes into the difficulties and the compound sinning that goes on with sexual immorality and things. But again, my thought would be, my encouragement would be not to minimize in some way the idea of sinning in the lust, because I think we do a disservice, because oftentimes in our culture, because we're so familiar with immorality, adultery, and those kinds of things, those sins almost seem less severe than they should in our minds. So everything needs to be, again, of utmost severity in our minds. Now, the Old Testament did have I would say the category and even the specific ideas relating to what Jesus says here. In other words, Jesus is not giving a whole new idea that never was present in the Old Testament when it came to lusting or being careful with your eyes when it comes to sin. There's plenty of passages that we can look at. And we're going to look at a couple tonight I want us to read that relate to being careful, little eyes, what you see and how you look at things as relates to either sexual morality or general life or other kinds of sins. So I want to get a couple of volunteers here. So I need someone to volunteer to read Job 31:1. Job 31:1. I'm going, okay, Daniel, okay. Nathan, I want you to read Numbers 15:39 to 40. Okay, Megan, I'd like you to read Psalm 119:37. So 119:37. Let's see here. We're going with the teen thing here. So Hannah, Proverbs 6:25 and 26. And one more teenager. Oh, Marion in the middle there. Isaiah 33:15 and 16. So we got a teenager crew here reading some scriptures. And again, the common theme here is either the relationship of the eyes and lust, or just the relationship of eyes to looking at wickedness. And the Bible speaks about those kinds of things. So Daniel, would you read Job 31:1?
I have made a covenant with my eyes. Tell them that I gaze at a virgin.
Okay, pretty straightforward. Job, this is a verse I tell people to memorize all the time. Make a covenant. Don't look at the things you should not to look at for reasons of keeping yourself pure. Good. Nathan, Numbers 15:39 and 40.
It shall be a tassel for you to look at and remember all the commandments of the Lord, so as to do them and not follow after your own heart and your own eyes, after which you fade the heart, so that you may remember to do all my commandments and be holy to you.
So the tassels, the little hanging tassels on the robes, were to be this visual reminder that be careful where your eyes look so as not to be drawn away after other things. So it's related to watch what you're looking at. Okay, good. Megan, Psalm 119, verse 37.
Turn away my eyes from looking at vanity and guide me in your ways.
Okay. Again, this request by the psalmist to not look at that which is vain, that which look is unhelpful or ungodly. Okay? Hannah, Proverbs 6:25 and 26.
Do not desire her beauty in your heart, and do not let her capture you with her eyelashes. For the price of a prostitute is only a loaf of bread, but a married woman hunts down a precious life.
Okay, again, this proverbial, don't be enticed by the eyelash. Don't be sucked in by that which is beautiful. Don't gaze at those things. The cost is great. Okay, Marion, Isaiah 33:15 and 16.
He who walks righteously and speaks with sincerity, he who rejects unjust gain and shakes his hands so that they hold no right, he who stops his ears from hearing bloodshed and shuts his eyes from looking upon evil. He will dwell on the heights. His refuge will be the impregnable rock. His bed will be given him. His water will be sure.
Okay, the contrast there, again, the one who, at the end of verse 15, shuts his eyes from looking upon evil, he will dwell upon the heights. He will be take refuge in the impregnable rock. Again, this idea of being careful at what your eyes, spiritual, physical, but what you're gazing at, what you're thinking on. So Jesus' words here, again, didn't come out of nowhere. He's applying the principle clearly that had been present in the Old Testament, but had been missed or had been conveniently forgotten about by the teachers of the day, because it's easier to manage, to close your eyes and let your mind go crazy than to deal with your mind and your heart with your eyes. I always tell people when they're dealing with particularly lust or whatever it might be, is, if all you do is throw away the device or turn off the whatever, you kind of get away from those the things that come into your mind. That's good, but that's what Pharisees do. If that's all you do, there needs to be more heart work in striving after Christ and mortifying those sinful desires in your heart. It's not just about kind of shading and covering your eyes. Now, if you don't do that, you're not really fighting. If you don't put away the things, you're not really fighting at all. But if that's all you do, all you're doing is fighting as a Pharisee. Because you need to fight and deal with the heart where those desires take root and take hold, as James says. So again, all these things that Jesus says here, they're not new, but he says them in such a powerful and clarifying way in the context in which he's living, that it is extremely disturbing to the status quo. And then briefly, the two examples exposing the severity of sin. If your eye causes you to stumble, cut it out. If your hand causes you to stumble, pluck it off or cut it off. Another context, a couple places, Jesus used the same kind of language. Says, if your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. I mean, so he's not just isolating in general teachings the eye or the hand necessarily. It's the overall picture is, if there is something that is a stumbling block that is leading you into sin, get rid of it. Don't actually mutilate your body. There was Origen and other kinds of Christian mystics would do those kinds of things. That's not what Jesus is talking about. But it is a severe kind of treatment. And again, the idea here is, think about in the context of the Bible times, your right hand was a symbol for strength. Your right eye was like the preferred eye. In other words, if you're going to lose one eye, it better not be your right eye. I mean, if you're going to be one arm, you're going to lose one hand. It's not going to be your right hand because you're right-handed. The idea is better to cut off your dominant hand than to allow it to continue to bring you into sinful situations. And again, the consequence is clear. Better to go into heaven maimed than to go into hell, because the consequence of unrepentant wickedness, of unrepentant adultery, idolatry, hate is, again, that's the consequence of condemnation. And finally, Jesus deals with the divorce dilemma. The last two verses, he says, you've heard it said, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say, everyone who divorces his wife, except for reasons of unchastity, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, just a couple quick things about this. Number one, a writ of divorce was a legal protection for the woman. In other words, I believe, some religions even today, some cultures today, say a man can divorce his wife by saying, I divorce you. He'll say it 3 times, and then she's done. There's no documentation, there's no proof, but he can say it and it's done. The writ of divorce was the legally binding paper saying that she's been released so that she can find another means of support, go back to her father's house, or go be married again. This is a safety thing for women, so she couldn't be put away in kind of a capricious way. It had to be public, it had to be witnessed, it couldn't be just kind of in the middle of a rageful fight kind of thing. So that was the thing about the certificate of divorce. And Jesus talks about this more in chapter 19, where that whole idea had been abused. That, again, the popular theological tradition in Jesus' day was basically that even if your wife overcooked your food, that was grounds for divorce. Or, as one rabbi said, if you find a prettier woman than you can divorce your wife. Again, this was the common kind of low way in which marital fidelity or sanctity was treated in Jesus' day. And so what Jesus does here, notice the very end here, he says, if you divorce your wife for any reason other than unchastity, you make her commit adultery, because the understanded reality is that for a woman, she's going to look to remarry. And if you've divorced her for any reason that's not legitimate, you're making her commit adultery when she gets remarried. But even more than that, what the equalizer is, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. This was shocking, actually, in Jesus' context. Because a married man, again, in the general kind of ideas, he wasn't the one who was guilty of adultery. It was more her. Now, whether it should have been that way or not, again, shouldn't have been. But he's putting them both on the same plane of committing adultery in this kind of, one marriage after another after another. This is part of the reason why the disciples in chapter 19 are blown away by, if marriage is to be like this, then, is it better not to be married at all? And Jesus says, well, for some people, that's the way to go, but not for most. It's a significant union that is to be guarded and protected with great force. So, This is Jesus' basic teaching here in these verses. So let's look at some questions here. One question is kind of thinking in our culture. How is marriage commonly portrayed in media today? Whatever that means. And in what ways is it helpful or hurtful to the Christian for maintaining a biblical picture of marriage? In other words, what do we see when we watch shows or whatever of marriage? And in what ways does it help or hurt kind of how we think about marriage? Any thoughts?
The wife is usually portrayed as kind of the dominant figure in the home, and the husband is usually portrayed as just kind of a dim-witted oaf. And obviously, I mean, that's terribly destructive.
Right? Okay. Yeah, I think that's an accurate observation and conclusion. Okay. Anybody else? Thoughts?
I think a lot of movies portray marriages when the excitement of love is gone, which is so sad to see.
Yeah, it's either one or the other. It's either like all excitement and all passion, or it's like dead and nothing. They don't have a health. I don't think they show healthy, loving marriage relationships in shows. The closest you might get is, what's the show Up, where you see that guy grow old with his wife? You know, that's about the closest you get in like a sweet, tender kind of marriage through the years. But that stands out because that's abnormal. You don't see those kinds of relationships in sweet, good ways in media. I think Stefan. Oh yeah. Okay. So yeah. What? The other side of is what possible problems could there be of these two crazy kids who get together? Right. Nothing. They met on a boat. What could go wrong? Or whatever. Who knows? But I mean, yeah, it's rooted in some kind of fiction, fantasy, some kind of unrealistic picture of either the worst or the fairy tale best, and either one sets you up for, I think, difficulties, because hopefully it's not going to be as bad as you see, or I mean, if you think it's going to be just as good as you see, you might have a rude awakening, because marriage with another sinner is a difficult, can be a difficult situation. So yeah, I think we have to realize that the media narratives that we get are not always very good, or usually not very good. And we have to be aware of that and not just let it kind of shape and mold our attitudes. Because I think sometimes if we're watching shows and there's interactions or whatever in marriage, that might be like, well, that's how normal people might interact in marriages. Well, I don't think that's necessarily even true too, because you have to be careful with taking those kinds of leads or whatever it is from a perverse and broken picture on how you ought to act or interact in marriage. Good. I think I had in my notes I had how was it portrayed? I said dumb husband, and I said it's a burden in life. Those are the two notes that I had in my answer. So I think we hit on all those and more. So that was good. That's how stuff is portrayed in media. Here's another kind of thing that maybe you've seen or heard, whether it's from the scientist or the sociologist or whatever it might be. How do we respond to modern claims that lustful thoughts are healthy and to be encouraged? This kind of, that's good and go with that. Or the claim the Bible's boundaries for sexual activity is actually harmful. How do we deal with those divergent things? In other words, lust is good and prohibitions are bad. How do we deal with those kinds of, or interact with those kinds of statements? Have anybody ever seen or heard any of those kinds of things where any prohibitions in the Bible are bad, and hey, we're just animals, and so I mean these are natural things. So what's wrong with that? And why not just? How do we interact with those things? Any thoughts?
This is such a simplistic view, but if you think of a fence around a playground, children play more joyfully and all the way to the boundary and feel safe within that boundary. When a fence is removed, the children don't necessarily feel the safety and maybe stay closer to the play equipment and are a little bit more scared. So God's boundaries are for our good.
Yeah, good answer. And I think that's a good way to frame the idea, is that the prohibition or the boundaries are there for good, around what is good, and for the good and protection of those inside of those boundaries. It is a good thing. And also, I would say this: these ideas of kind of promiscuity, or the body is for this, these are not new progressive ideas. In 1 Corinthians, that was one of the things that the church, that the philosophers in Corinth would be like, well, the body is for food and the food is for the body. And so, I mean, what does it matter what you do, how you eat, and what about and who you do things with it? Where it's just physical things. Well, that's not a new thought. That's a foolish, wicked thought that's been brought up in the past. As a matter of fact, I don't think I wrote it down here in this area. But if you look at, I think it's don't turn there now, but Leviticus 18 and 19 goes through basically 2 chapters of, these are examples of things that are going on in Canaan, these kinds of sexual immorality activities that Israel was not to do. Everything from incest to all kinds of other things, and including idolatry and stuff like that. But I mean, there was a great wide Wild West openness of immorality that was accepted inside of and around the Canaanite Egyptian cultures. And basically the only rule was, if you can, it's okay. That was the only rule. If you can get away with it, it's okay. That was the only real rule in societies, except for maybe, if someone's married, you don't want to, you might anger their spouse. That's about as far as it might go. But the Bible speaks about particular, things because there's particular excesses that it was dealing with. How does this passage that we looked at today reflect God's view on marriage and fidelity? What does it tell us about God's nature? Anything we learn about God and his nature, about marriage and fidelity? Anything about this that relates to who God is?
Just thinking about how God created everything perfect, and marriage is one of the things that God created. Our sin is what holds us apart, this fallen world, this looking back on it. It is a perfect union. God created Adam and Eve, so it was a perfect union. And sin is what God shows he is creates things good.
Yeah. I agree. I think it's God creates things that are good. He wants us to engage in that which is good in all areas of life. Okay, anything else? We learn about kind of broadly thinking about God and the Christian life.
He wants spouses to keep their commitments, and that reflects his character. He's faithful.
Yeah.
And keeps
Yeah, we see that in Ephesians chapter 6 or chapter 5, that the marriage is like a picture of Jesus in the church, and it's that husbands love their wives as Christ loved the church, and there's supposed to be this great kind of like foreshadowing, looking at this is how it ought to be, and we can do this in ways that are better and more faithful. But Jesus loves us perfectly. I thought of Psalm 51:6 just kind of as applying this scripture to the overall ideas of God and what he requires. It says this: "Behold, you desire truth in the innermost being, and in the hidden part you will make me know your wisdom." Again, God, he doesn't just desire us not to do the thing out here. He desires us to be true and faithful in here. He's always desired that. And again, this is not new, it's not different, but it is clear and with no questions, with no punches pulled when Jesus is teaching here in Matthew chapter 5. We have time for what's a good test question that you can use when you're evaluating the media that you consume or the things that you do, what you look at? What's a good test question to say, is it, should I be doing this? Should I be listening to this, watching this? What's a good test? Is there kind of a good paradigm shaping question or principle that we can use to kind of be just to evaluate and to keep our eyes from looking at that which is not good?
Is this pure?
Okay, is it pure? Okay. Anybody else?
And I think one thing that really changes is Jesus was sitting right next to me.
Yeah, that's good. The Lord is next to me, but imagining that in a more tangible way, yeah, good. Anybody else? I kind of went the same way that Stephanie did, thinking of Philippians chapter 4. Whatever is good, lovely, worthy of praise. If there's anything honorable or good repute, think on these things. Is it, again, the difficult thing that I know that I have to wrestle with is to continually say, what is the, not is how bad is this too bad, or is this good? It's the question of having that positive question. And when we do that, it will keep more of that stuff from being in our orbit, so as to help our hearts not be flooded with the filth that we have to continually pump out and try to keep our hearts clean. Last question. Okay, I think it's the second to last one on your outlines there, number F, or letter F. Okay, this one I'd love to have some thoughts. Okay, do not look with lust is a negative command. In other words, don't do this, and we get that. How can we relate the same principle in a positive command? Think about it this way. When we talk about modesty, we say dress modestly. That's a positive thing. In a certain way, do this thing. How can we speak about what we look at in a positive way? In other words, don't just look with lust, but look in this way. How can I think and regard my eyes? Look so as to think what? Or look with this attitude. How can we think of this in a positive way? That would be, again, you're not looking with lust because you're looking what? How are you looking? Any thoughts?
Consider others as more important than ourselves and as brothers and sisters.
Yeah, as more important, or as brothers and sisters. I love that. Good. So look, as at a brother or sister, son or daughter. Looking at someone in that way. Good, with consideration. Anybody else? That's good. Any thoughts? Positive ways to look at someone. In other words, don't look with lust, but look with a positive view of. Couple I thought was, actually that was the first one I thought of too, Rachel. Look with integrity. Am I looking? Is the way that I'm viewing things? Is that a thing that is done with integrity? Look with respect. Look with compassion. I mean, and look at the person. I think we need to think in again a positive way. We want to be careful to not look with lust, and to do so, one of the ways to do that is to look with care, compassion, thinking of others as important and valuable. having integrity with my eyes and the way that I look and think, respecting that person. Again, I think those are all positive ways that we can think about looking that's going to accomplish the prohibition of not looking with lust. Any final comments or thoughts as we close tonight? Okay, let's close in prayer. Lord God, thank you so much for tonight, that we can have time to discuss this important subject of faithfulness. Lord, I pray that we would be boys and girls, men and women, who want to have eyes and actions that are pure, hearts and words that are pure. Help us to, as the book of Hebrews says, protect and guard that the marriage that either we are in, or that one day, Lord willing, others that they will be in, Lord, that they will guard those things with intentional carefulness, that we would honor you today in all of our ways. In Christ's name, amen.